Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the HR Huddle. I'm your host, Teri Zipper, CEO and Managing Partner at Sapient Insights Group. We're back for another exciting episode of HR We Have a Problem. Today, I'm joined by Sarah Rodehorst, CEO of Onward's HR. Sarah co-founded the firm after 20 years of experience launching SaaS solutions for startups as well as Fortune 500 companies. And Onwards is focused on making layoffs and terminations consistent, compliant, and supportive. So we're going to find out how we do that today. So I'm excited to have Sarah on with me today. Hi, Sarah. Welcome to the show.
Hi. Well, thank you so much, Teri, for having me.
So this is going to be interesting. We were talking a few weeks ago about a very difficult and challenging topic and decided some of the information we were discussing would be very helpful to companies and employees at this time of year. So we're going to break down layoffs and terminations and what you can do to improve the experience, if that's possible. I think it might be. So let's get into the huddle. So these are very difficult topics, Sarah, whether you're a decision maker, deciding who's going to be on the quote unquote list, whether you have to deliver the message, and of course, whether you're receiving the message, right? And I've been on both sides of this equation in my career. I don't know if you've experienced the same, but I thought we'd break this into two parts. I want to talk first about the company experience, what all happens there, and then talk about the employee experience. And, under the company experience, there's been a lot going on the last few weeks. Tech is Alphabet, Twitter, Meta, they're laying people off. Financial services, Morgan Stanley, e-commerce, Amazon. It's just going on all over the board. And obviously, this is a challenging time in general. So talk a little bit about how companies typically approach this process and what are some of the complexities that these organizations have to consider when going through this process and making these decisions about, what are we going to do for the next year and how is this going to impact our organization?
Yeah, it's like you said, it's a really crazy time right now. I think according to Layoff FYI, I think it's 150,000 employees have been laid off just in 2022 alone, which is really, really a crazy number. But the reality is actually 12% of employees, even in any year, are involuntarily separated as part of a layoff or termination in even the best of times. So although we're seeing it in headlines and, it's top of mind for everyone right now, they do happen all the time, unfortunately. But, thinking about how companies approach it, it's always a really tough decision. A lot of times it's financially driven. That's kind of the reasons behind it. We're seeing a lot of it in the tech space where these companies raised big capital. There were these great growth plans. Interest rates were low. So they were able to kind of get these higher valuations and they're growing. And then all of a sudden, really the sales aren't where they expected them to be. And now with the turn in economics, they're faced with really tough decisions. And ultimately, one of the biggest costs a company has is people. And that's in part why we're seeing a lot of these layoffs right now.
Yeah, it can be disconcerting, right? You're constantly seeing a new name in the news every day about what's going on. And, I think the companies have a lot of work to do they got a lot of decision making. That's not an easy process. You got to think about, well, how are we going to get the work done? Right. The work isn't necessarily going away, or not all of it anyway. And, so if we lay off this group of people, can we still get the work done?
Yeah. And that's one of the biggest challenge with any kind of a layoff situation. These aren't everyday things, especially when they're larger in size, which is a lot of what we're seeing in the headlines right now. And so just like you said, HR has to handle this and managers have to handle this workload on top of what they do every single day and move forward often with less resources, because ultimately, and what we're seeing is a lot of these impacts are even impacting HR, which is really an unfortunate thing as well. And so trying to do more with less really just doesn't work always. And so in addition, traditionally, companies have managed this process manually. So when you look at what goes into a layoff, you do have to identify those employees that are ultimately impacted. And you have to determine the selection criteria for them and really go through a step of processes. And traditionally, companies have done that entirely manually. So they're doing this in spreadsheets. They're doing this in email, and they're sharing this information across the board in just really asynchronous ways, which can be very challenging from a process standpoint, but it also poses a lot of risk of errors.
Oh, highly risky. And, one of the questions I want to talk about who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong and what are some of the big ahas. But what you just said made me think of a time where the wrong person got let go because of the whole spreadsheet conundrum, right?
Yeah.
The process just kind of broke down somewhere and someone got communicated to that shouldn't have got communicated to. So anything can happen when you're doing it that way. And, there's so many other pieces of that, right? So all of the things that need to happen outside of that decision as to who is going to be let go, the severance conversation, the warrants, state regulations, there's just a whole host of things. Can you kind of just walk down the list of things that people need to make sure that they're on top of during this process?
Definitely. So anytime you're kind of going through a separation, in general, they're complex, they're time consuming, and they're risky, like we've talked about. But, well in advance of the actual notification date is really when the planning starts. And typically what happens is there's some number that the company is trying to target, and they have to try and understand how best to go about hitting that target. And so they look at what is the reason behind the termination. So they have to justify the reduction. And then they'll identify what the selection criteria. So if it is related to cutting costs, if they're going to identify performance reasons, they will have to be consistent on applying that across the entire organization. So that ends up being a lot of conversations. Typically, it starts with a very few people that actually have insights into this process. It'll be typically at a CEO level, strategic HR leaders, your finance leader, and then you're going to have to start bringing in your key managers into the conversation, those that will be staying, to determine who is critical to stay and really helping make some of those tough decisions. And then it's about the communication. So much about having a positive exit experience is about planning that communication, making sure it is consistent, making sure everyone is on the same page of how it's going to happen. A lot of best practices are around, depending on how many people are impacted, it's always best to have a one-on-one conversation.
Yeah.
A lot of times you'll have the manager schedule those meetings with the individual that's ultimately impacted. And then HR will join those meetings and make sure that everything happens smoothly as part of the exit process. Now, with remote workers, it's always best to do it in person, but that's not always possible, right? So you got to take into consideration how to go about doing it in a virtual environment. And that will also take into some considerations as far as while you're communicating, making sure it's personal, that one-on-one conversation. But in the event that you have a larger reduction in force, you may not be able to have a one-on-one conversation all at the same time, right? Because once you have one, that's when things spread like wildfire and everyone is informed. And so sometimes it's best to have a single, more executive meeting where everyone is informed of what is happening, and that there will be a follow-up one-on-one discussions where they can have those discussions in a more personal setting. What the worst case scenario as part of a notification is to do it in a group scenario without giving an employee an opportunity to have a conversation. They're going to have questions. They're going to want to talk through it. And in a group setting, it's very impersonal. And there isn't that opportunity for the back and forth conversation.
Right.
It's going to be frustrating, and they need to have an opportunity to have an outlet and have a conversation and react to the news that they're receiving.
Yeah. Like I said, it's a very complex process. It takes time. And it's also very heavily dependent on certain activities having to happen before those conversations can happen. I know it's gotten more complex given the last couple of years with the remote workforce. You mentioned that. That's also created some problems from a regulation and compliance perspective, right? Because a lot of organizations are in states now that they weren't in before, and there's totally different, rules and regulations in those states.
Yes, regulations, it's highly regulated across the board. So a couple of different areas. One that we hear that's making headlines, especially with Twitter and with Tesla, is WARN, right? What is WARN? Well, WARN is the Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act. There's a federal WARN, and you'll also hear from time to time a concept called mini WARNs. Now, it's basically a regulation that is enforced by the DOL to ensure that people have appropriate notification ahead of an actual termination. So employees, when WARN is triggered, and we'll talk about what is triggered means in a second, but when WARN is triggered, employers must give employees 60 days notice in the event of a mass layoff. Now, that's at a federal level. If we look at these mini WARNs, there's specific states like California, Connecticut, DC, and a few others that have mini WARNs. And these mini WARNs are regulations that are almost more, they typically protect the employee more so than the federal regulation, and can have different requirements around those. So for example, New Jersey just came out with new regulation where they're, instead of the 60 days notice, they're actually requiring up to 90 days notice. And there's a couple of other states that fall along those lines as well. So WARN is something that all companies need to be aware of. Now, when WARN is triggered at the federal level, you typically need to have 50 people within a given location for the same business reason for that to be triggered. And, we talked about what it means to be triggered. If it doesn't get triggered, then there isn't the requirement to provide that 60 days notice. But we do always recommend some level of notice if possible, whether it's working or non-working. Other requirements or considerations, visas. I mean, we're talking about a lot of tech companies out there right now, and a lot of the employees may be here on H-1B visas. And, requirements under that, those employees need time to be able to find another job, or they may not be able to stay in the country. And so that's another consideration that is out there that employers really need to be aware of, as well as the biggie out there. People want to be able to terminate at will, right? And are able to terminate at will, except for when it comes to discrimination, because discrimination is illegal across the board. You just can't do that. And what does that mean? It means ultimately you have to be able to defend any of your decisions and make sure that you're not adversely impacting any protected populations. And so we do recommend as a best practice, anytime you're doing an exit that involves a large number and even a small number of employees, that you run adverse impact analysis to make sure there isn't any bias that could be misunderstood or understood to be discrimination.
Yeah, no, that's, you could probably do a whole another session on just talking about that part of the process. There's been a lot, we said, a lot of companies, a lot of interesting approaches to this year. And I mean, this is not new, but it's been heavily in the headlines. You mentioned Twitter and Tesla, better.com, United Furniture, who just sent people text messages while they were sleeping. I mean, these are just awful. I can't even imagine what people are thinking when they make that decision. But, what are some of the right and wrong things to do here? Because clearly sending people a text message or tweeting it out or doing it on a conference call with the entire organization, it just makes no sense.
It's hard. I mean, I think a lot of times companies haven't been through this before and they just react, right? They just do instead of pausing for a second and thinking and planning ahead to make sure that they're making the right decisions. And we found a lot of companies, and I think a lot of these mistakes is because people just don't have the experience that they should. They haven't put the time to proactively understand what they want that exit experience to be before it's happening. So they just react and they don't always make the best choices. So if we break down the different scenarios of what the companies have done, we actually just did a whole webinar just on the costly mistakes, termination and layoff mistakes that companies have made and how to prevent them. So we can make we probably do 2 or 3 different sessions on all the mistakes out there, but it's not always bad decisions. Sometimes it's difficult processes, right? So better.com has 2 scenarios out there, or 2 rounds of layoffs that both provide examples of what not to do. The first one being the mass notification through the CEO that I think you already referenced. Now, the second one that isn't as well known is around there was a series of individuals that received severance as part of a second layoff that they had. And we do fully support severance to be offered because it helps ease the transition for those employees. Now, the catch in this scenario is that the employees found out that they were terminated because they received the severance in their paycheck. They had yet to be notified that they were terminated. And so it's just one of those things that I can't imagine there was ever the intent to go about the process that way. But it wasn't a choice, right? It was a failure in the process. They likely were managing it manually. They didn't have the checks and balances in place to make sure that the order of operations happened as they should. My guess is they had a date change. They were going to move forward with a notification date, and that date got pushed back, but somehow payroll was still notified, but didn't have the update for the new date, and things just got muddled. But that ultimately produces a poor exit experience. And that's when it makes headlines. That's when it goes on social media. And the big impact to a company where with an offboarding that goes wrong is a lot around their corporate reputation. And, it's just never good to be in the headlines about a separation mistake.
Yeah. No, it creates poor brand. It creates, and actually it's hugely expensive if they've made some mistakes and they've got to account for those mistakes. It could be very costly to the organization.
Yeah, well, it will be costly in many different facets. One, if there's a lawsuit, right? We see now with Tesla and with Twitter that these individuals that did not get the 60-day notice under Warren are now filing lawsuits against the companies, right? So that's one area where it's costly. Another is in the corporate brand and reputation. Ultimately, companies want to be able to recruit people. And we found a study showed that 84% of employees would consider a pay cut in exchange from an offer with the company from a better reputation. And so every company needs to really ask do they need to improve that exit process to make sure that exit experience is positive, not only to avoid lawsuits and to file and comply with the law, but to make sure that exit experience is positive so that they can really build loyal alumni out there that ultimately are going to be at customers, even if they don't come back. I know there's a big kind of focus around recruiting alumni employees, but they're also at your customers, right? They're talking with potential candidates. They could be working at partners. And then you have your investors. And so there's just so many reasons to do right by employees, to treat them with respect, and to invest in your exit and offboarding process to make sure you handle it in a consistent, fair, and supportive manner.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, this is never an easy time for the companies, but it's never an easy time for the employee when, they're on this list. And sometimes just the sheer threat of annual reductions in force creates a lot of stress for other employees. You don't know if you're on the list, right? And so that can create a lot of stress during that time of year. Are you seeing companies doing anything with respect to that approach, or how they're managing this process from an employee offboarding perspective? And, what are employees' expectations?
Well, I think one of the things we've seen from a lot of our customers, and we work with them to help kind of build this, is just to make sure the whole experience is positive and supportive. But what does that mean, right? It's one thing to say, okay, let's provide a positive and supportive experience. But what does that mean when you're talking about an exit approach? So it is about planning, right? It is about putting a standardized process in place, putting the right technology in place, because managing these from a spreadsheet and email, HR always has the best intention. They always do. I mean, that is why they're in HR, because they care about people and they want to make sure that the culture is positive. And so but to have a consistent and fair and supportive process, you need to plan, you need to invest, put the process in place, put the tools in place so that you can not have the mistakes. So step one, it's kind of when you have the hierarchy. Step one, don't make mistakes, right? Don't just make these clerical errors, so on and so forth. Two is about the communication. So this is where it's about who and when do you communicate. And there's, we talked briefly about how you communicate to your management. It starts with a smaller group, and then you need to bring in people along the way up until the point of the notification day. Plan about how it goes. Make sure the message across every communication is consistent. Everyone understands what to say and what not to say as part of that process. Manager training comes into play here. Get everyone on the same page so that notification day happens efficiently, because a slow process, notifying people slowly, has repercussions of itself, because of people's social media, texts. So you got to be efficient with the communication. You need to be consistent, and you need to be thoughtful. And then there's the post-planning, just like what you said, is about the people that stay. So you have the employees that are leaving. You want to make sure you provide them with all the information they need, because you don't want them to have a ton of questions, but you do want them to be able to have the opportunity to ask questions. So the two things there is try and think of every question they may have and proactively give them answers to that. But then secondarily, give an opportunity to ask and you answer questions that they may have that you haven't had that opportunity to proactively give them. So make sure you think through those channels so that they can communicate back with you and get those answers to their questions. But then it's about recovery, right, from the layoff internally. What is the communication that you have to the employees that stay? One of the things that we've kind of thought a lot about and talked to our customers about is when you have a layoff situation, there's kind of two approaches. You can do a big bang layoff if you know what you have to go about, a number, or you can trickle it. And, some of the theories behind it is that it's almost better to have one event, go out and communicate it. It may be a bigger event, but then you can go back to those employees that stay and say, that's behind us. We had the layoff. Now it's about recovery. Versus when you do have layoff after layoff after layoff, maybe they're smaller, but that happens 1 month, then the next month, and the third month. That's going to weigh on people's confidence, right? They're like, what's next? You said we had one. Is there another one coming? How can I trust that my job is secure? And so, one of the things we do recommend is to kind of like rip the Band-Aid off, make the decision, move forward, do it well, and then focus on recovery.
Yeah. How have you seen communication to the employees that are left? I mean, one of my experiences was the organization that I was working for at the time. They never communicated who left or who was gone. It was just sort of in a vacuum, like you had to stumble upon the information the next time you tried to reach out to that person, which was very difficult. And I'm sure there's reasons why companies approach it that way. I don't know if you've had any experience with any organizations and working with them on how they actually do that follow-up communication and what kinds of things they can say during that process.
Yes, it's one of those things. We believe it is best to be transparent as you can be, without the risk, right? You always have to weigh risks in anything you do related to this manner. So it is a sensitive topic, but as much as you can be proactive on the reason behind it and stand behind it, right? I mean, I think a lot of what employees staying are looking at is the culture. What was the reason behind the decision? Were there other options? And were they considered before the company chose to move forward with the layoff? And if the leadership can stand behind that, I think it will be better received. Obviously, it's still hard news anytime anyone goes through this, but I think that's what employees ultimately want to hear, right? Is that leadership takes accountability for where the business is, that they put the effort into alternative options that they could have pursued. And after kind of weighing all of that, okay, it could not be avoided. Now they just invest in making sure that the process is positive and that they put the time into that as well. And I think that's how they build trust or try and regrow that trust with current employees. So we do believe in communication as much as is appropriate. And, it typically is well received by current employees. There's actually a study or a paper by the Harvard Business Review talking specifically about this, about the exits and about the communication. And they compared two different companies. One company actually offered more severance benefits, whereas the other company did a better job communicating where they were and the decisions and being transparent about a fairer process. And they studied those two companies and compared them over a course of a year. And it was that second company that really focused on communications and a fair process that was in a better position at the end of that year. It was a very interesting paper.
Yeah, I'd love to know more about that. Maybe we can tweet that out after the show. Yeah, because communications is so easily missed, right? It's just one of those things that if you don't have it on the project plan and you aren't very specifically focused on it, it's just such a key part of anything, not just this process, but just about any process where you're trying to communicate a message to your employees or to the market about your business and about your culture and your brand that carries forward into everything that you do.
Yeah, I think that is very true. And it's just about standing behind what you do, right? Saying, Now we're going to focus on growth and getting back and recovery, and then standing behind that and doing what they say in those communications.
Yeah. Yeah. Are there any specific experiences or other examples that you can think of where an organization you'd say did a really great job around this? Because obviously everybody's going to have to do this at some point. Nobody's immune to this process, maybe in 1 year versus another, but eventually every organization is going to go through this process. Are there any that you've seen that do a great job that you'd want to mention here, or at least talk about what they did?
Yeah, I think there's, one company that comes to mind, TruePill, ended up being in a tough situation. The CEO kind of stated a very public message. The process was very efficient and proactive. Communications were positive. And so, that was an example that they did very well. Peloton did an excellent job too. They were supporting. One of the big things about exits is helping their employees find other placement. And I think Peloton almost started the social share of, I'm recommending this person for another job. There's a lot of sharing experience, so on and so forth. And so I think kind of putting your neck out there in a public setting for a lot of these employees that have been impacted, it goes a long way for the corporate image.
Yeah. Anything that they can do to help that offboarding process. And are you seeing a lot of organizations help the employee find other opportunities within the business before they're let go, or through that process? Is that sort of a standard part of the process?
It is a standard part of the process. We're actually working with a company right now that is, because of the exit process, it's a merge, right? There's multiple companies coming together, and you look at your corporate roles and there's a lot of duplications. So ultimately, it ends up being about finding the open positions, because there are open positions at the company, and getting them placed. And so it's kind of pairing up what those skills are for those that are impacted, because ultimately, when you do have a reduction in force, it's typically the role, not the person that's impacted. And so those people then can find their ways into open positions. And that's a huge thing, especially for these large enterprise businesses. As we hear in the headlines, one day it's layoffs, and then we hear in the headlines, here's X number of open positions. And why are we out of sync with those two? And there's an opportunity here to really bring them together. And that's a lot of what we do and help our customers kind of find and pair those people with positions.
Yeah. Yeah. Because it doesn't make sense to put people out and then turn around and bring them back, right? The training and the effort there is already taken place, right? So why not just transition them to other roles if it's possible?
Well, and that's one of the advantages of having technology. When you do manage the exit process as a whole in a manual fashion in spreadsheets, it's really hard for the rest of the organization to have insights on who's ultimately going to be impacted. And you have invested in these employees. They know your company, they know your product, they know how to do the work and do it well, many of them. And so you want to keep them. And as much as you can pair them with open positions is just the right thing to do for the employee. It's the right thing to do for the company. And making that easy, really the best way to do it is by leveraging technology so that you have that transparency well in advance. And sometimes, even looking at that ahead of the employee even knowing, right? So managers can ultimately encourage people to apply for other positions before there's any notification, because once that notification comes out, it ends up being a harder, you're now to get them into those other open positions, you're still going to have to do some kind of recruiting. So as much as you can get ahead of that, the better for all.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, some people have sponsors within the organization that will help, push them to other leaders within the organization. But a lot of this falls back to talent acquisition and understanding the skills and capabilities of the people that you have and where they might fit somewhere else within the organization.
Yeah.
Is there anything that so a lot of organizations are going through this right now. Probably at this point, they've already made the decision, but there may still be some people looking to make that decision, especially as the economy is looking like it's softening. Is there any recommendations or, the top 2 or 3 things you would say to an organization, don't forget to do these 3 things. If you do nothing else, make sure you do these things in order to, to make this as good as it can be?
Well, I would say 1 is to plan ahead because you never know what the future is going to be. So make sure you know what your exit process is and you have the right tools in place in order to make that a positive experience for your employees. And really to make sure you don't make mistakes. I mean, because that's step number 1.
Yeah. So if you're not doing any layoffs, at least start thinking about what might happen if you have to.
Exactly. And it's about your whole exit process, not just layoffs, right? There's involuntary terminations, you have resignations. The whole exit process as a whole really deserves attention because there's so many factors. It's really the last opportunity that a company has to make an impression on that employee before they go out into the world. And it's about building that alumni network. So I do want to broaden it to beyond just layoffs, but you do need to have a process in place. 2 is around communication, right? Be thoughtful of the communication, how you go about it, the order of operations. And 3 is the regulations. So, we talked about WARN, we talked about the EEOC and adverse impact. There's also state variations around separation agreements that need to be considered. We worked with one customer that came to us and had a set of separation agreements, and every one of them had California language in it, and they got those from an attorney. And so it's one of those things you just got to make sure that you have the right compliance as part of that exit process as well. So those would be my recommendations. 1 is plan ahead, have that process. 2 is make sure you're thoughtful in your communications. And then 3, just make sure you stay in compliance across the board.
All great suggestions in these challenging times, I would say. Well, that's all the time we have for today. I loved this topic. It is as hard as it is. It's also something that we just have to face and think about and consider. If anyone has any questions or comments, please send us a message. You'll see us on Twitter and LinkedIn, and we'll be posting this episode next week. Also, like and follow us on your favorite podcast platform. Thanks for joining. Cheers.